All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. So I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Erin Guthrie. I'm the marketing manager for Decentralized Energy Canada. And I just wanted to go over some logistics for the panel today. We're going to be taking Q&A for the last 15 to 20 minutes. And anybody who has questions, you're welcome to pop them into the Q&A chat. And we will be addressing those closer to the end of the panel. And I'm just going to start off with a quick presentation on who DEC is. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a brief introduction into Impact Careers, which is the overarching program that this panel is involved with. And the main goal is to encourage people to take action and to choose a career in sustainability. So a little bit about DEC. DEC is a national nonprofit industry association dedicated to the development of decentralized energy. We have roughly 100 members that range from startups all the way up to corporate organizations. Our bread and butter is connecting decentralized energy companies to business opportunities, both nationally and globally. If you're interested in becoming a member or would like to learn a bit more about us, you're welcome to visit our website at deassociation.ca. And impact careers. So the whole goal is to identify the jobs of the future and how the UN's SDGs are going to be integrated into the job market. So we've kind of focused on these 7 SDGs. Today's panel discussion is going to be focused on SDG11. And our main goal is to educate and connect job seekers to sustainable employers. And I just wanted to give a shout out to our program partners who are our sponsors that are able to make impact careers happen. So Schneider Electric, EHRC, Women in Power, and Alberta Innovates. That's it. That's my information in case anybody is interested in reaching out. And I will pass it off to Steph to start off the panel.
Thanks so much, Erin, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So as Erin mentioned in the intro, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into SDG number 11 today. So to give you a bit of a background for those not as familiar with the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that was adopted by all UN member states in 2015. So there's been a number of years that these have been worked on basically and continue to be. So the 17 goals that are set out, these 17 SDGs, are a call for global cooperation and action by all countries around the world. And they recognize that ending poverty and other social issues must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working to preserve our natural world. So, you know, the easy stuff. Each SDG outlines a challenge or topic that needs to be addressed if we are to succeed in creating a truly sustainable future. So SDG number 11 is what we're going to focus our discussion on today, and that SDG is sustainable cities. And it has the goal of making cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Our world is urbanizing at a very rapid pace, and urban areas face big challenges to curb inequality and remain sustainable at the same time. One of the key challenges is around energy, which is sort of where the DEC piece fits in, and what we're going to focus a little bit more on today. Cities occupy just 3% of the Earth's land, but account for 60 to 80% of the energy consumption and 75% of carbon emissions. So you can see that those urban areas are really important if we're going to hit our targets and work on these sustainable development goals. Many cities are also more vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters due to their high concentration of people and their location. So building urban resilience is crucial to avoid human, social, and economic losses. And just for clarity as well, for those joining us, when we say urban and cities, we don't necessarily, I mean, the big cities are sort of one of the major targets, but in Alberta, when we say urban, we basically just mean any grouping of people that lives together. So we have representatives here from towns, villages, and cities. So what we're going to discuss today is what are Alberta communities doing and what can they do to address this larger issue. So first, I'm going to ask that each of the panelists that's joining us today introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about one sustainable initiative that their municipality or company is most proud of. So I'm going to go just by who I see first. Sherry Young, would you like to start us off, please?
Okay, I think I've got that off mute. Hi, and thanks for having me. I'm Sherry Young. I'm the Climate Change and Energy Specialist with the town of Okotoks, which is a small town of 30,000 people just south of Calgary in southern Alberta. What are we proud of? We're really proud of being one of the leaders in Alberta on sustainable initiatives. 15 years ago, we put in a 52 home energy efficient project based on solar thermal, completely heated by solar thermal in a community through a community energy project. Most recently, we won a couple of awards for our groundbreaking natural asset inventory. So we want to just keep moving forward on sustainable communities and renewable energy to meet our targets of net zero by 2050.
Super, thanks, Sherry. Next, Mark, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Baxter. I'm program lead for the renewables programs with the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. I've been in this role for a little over 5 years now. For those that maybe aren't aware of what the Action Center is, we are a partnership between the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, Rural Municipalities of Alberta, and the Government of Alberta, founded in 2009 to provide a variety of supports to municipalities in the form of funding and technical assistance and education to help them address climate change through both mitigation and adaptation. We, as the MCCAC, have accomplished a lot since 2009, so it's hard to pick one thing to be, super proud of in particular. There's been some incredible projects across the board for municipalities in our programs, both from municipalities like Okotoks and Ryley that we have here with us today. I guess for me and my portfolio particularly, our recent, over the last couple of years, accomplishment of being able to bring what we now have as 10 municipalities to electrically net zero in their operations through our Alberta Municipal Solar Program has been one of my personal favorite achievements that we've managed to succeed in, and I'm sure Glenn will be talking more about that as one of the municipalities that has done that themselves.
Super, thanks, Mark. Well, with that nice segue, let's go to Glenn.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Mark, actually. So I am the Chief Administrative Officer, CAO for the Village of Ryley. Highway 14 juts off at about 4 o'clock out of Edmonton. It heads off to Wainwright, and Ryley is about square center between Edmonton and Wainwright. But it's also square center in the county of Beaver County, and which runs along Highway 14. And Highway 14, there are 4 urban municipalities in Beaver. So you've got the Beaver County rural, and then starting with Tofield at the largest, just to the west of us, at about 2,000 people. And then at the other end, you've got Viking at 1,000 people. And I'm rounding off, of course. We are in the middle with Holden. Ryley has 500 and Holden has 300. So that's the 4 municipalities, the 5 group county partnership. And in fact, Mark mentioned it, within Beaver County, Viking, down to the other end, implemented a net zero as well. They've got a 1 megawatt micro generator down there. And they and us in Ryley, we've got our 144 kilowatt micro generator that we generated. So the two of the 4 urbans in Beaver County have gone net zero, and we're quite proud of that. So yeah, thank you to the MCCAC, and we feel we're quite proud of the fact, both municipalities are very proud of the fact that we're contributing to a cleaner earth.
Super, thanks, Glenn. And last but not least for our panelists, we have Myrna. So Myrna, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure, hi, I'm Myrna Bittner. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Run With It Synthetics. And we create geospatially accurate digital living models of cities and regions so that our customers can dial forward really complex kinds of systems that include their people, their policy considerations, their infrastructure, new technologies that they may be looking at adopting, and as well as run scenarios. So scenarios that involve all kinds of what ifs, from disaster scenarios to daily scenarios of life and livelihoods, but also scenarios where there's profound or disruptive change or opportunities. And one of the things that I'm most proud about in the last year has been really what we've been able to accomplish globally with some amazing partners. And one of the things that comes to mind for me most in terms of actual kind of measurable sustainability impact was a project where we were one of the finalists in the City Architecture of Tomorrow Challenge with the Toyota Mobility Foundation. And we worked on synthesizing Kuala Lumpur from here in Canada and never having been there, which was quite extraordinary. But really it was on how to engage their population in using public transit without building more public transit. So, and actually measuring down to the number of additional, bike stand stalls that were needed, and mapping that to GHG impact and congestion on roadways and how it enabled economic access for people who were in underserviced segments of the population, how it affected gender equity on public transportation through policies involving safety and security and pedestrian journeys, and even looking at their aging population and how certain mitigations along the way could really enable people who had very complex travel patterns accomplish their first and last mile. So that to me was really we actually got to put some billion-dollar GHG reductions and GDP gains on the map in our scenarios, which was cool.
Super, thanks, Myrna. I also realized that I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. So I'm Stephanie Ripley. I work alongside Mark, actually. He's with the MCCAC team, and I used to work directly with him. I've moved over to be more involved with the AUMA AMSC team, so Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, and AMSC, which is the Alberta Municipal Services Corporation, is a wholly owned subsidiary of AUMA. So many acronyms, it gets a little bit difficult to keep track. But I'm one of the program leads for the Clean Energy Improvement Program, which is a program that will allow municipalities to offer financing in Alberta to their residents, to their property owners, to be able to implement clean energy improvements on their properties. So renewable energy or energy efficiency projects through financing from the municipality, and it's tied to their property and not to the property owner themselves. So it's a financing mechanism that's being used in a few other places in Canada, many states in the US, to try and sort of reduce that barrier to people completing these kinds of projects. So that's the Clean Energy Improvement Program in Alberta is new. The legislation was just passed a couple of years ago to enable it, and we're just about to launch the first 3 programs in Alberta in the next few weeks here. So that's sort of, I guess, the project that I'm most proud of, as it's the one I'm most involved with right now. But that's me, and I'm going to be moderating today. So with all of those great introductions, thanks again to everyone for joining us. We'll jump into that sort of our first question. So I know it got mentioned a little bit in the intros, that term net zero that we hear a lot in targets. We hear it a lot in just people talking about how we achieve these sustainability goals. And I think it is important to acknowledge, to sort of dig a little bit deeper into that. Canada has set an ambitious goal to be net zero by 2050. But what does zero actually mean? Is it actually zero? When we talk about net zero in terms of electric, so that's something that, Glen and the town of Viking, they're electrically net zero, which means that they're producing as much electricity as they're consuming from a municipal standpoint, but it's not fully net zero because there's lots of other energy that goes on in there as well. So I think it's sort of a term that's worth digging into a little bit more. So I might get Sherry to start us off on that one. So does zero actually mean zero, Sherry?
Well, that's a big topic to start on. So you're right, there's a lot of ways to measure net zero. So first of all, net zero, as you said, means you're putting out or you're using as much as you're putting out, right? So I'll let Glenn talk about what net zero electricity is, but often when we make goals like the Canadian government goals and the town of Okotoks' goal of net zero by 2050, that means net zero carbon, which means our gross emissions are equal or less than our gross carbon sequestration or removal of carbon from the atmosphere. So the reason this is important is because if you're a small municipality surrounded by trees, perhaps you're already net zero for carbon because the trees are taking out more than your small municipality is putting into the air. However, generally and globally, that's not the case, which is why why carbon is increasing in the atmosphere and why we've already the global temperature has already warmed by 1 degree. So yeah, and that's why our goal is to become net zero. It's not because we want everybody to go back to living in caves. It's because we want to make sure that our energy is as efficient as possible and that we are investing in technologies and energy that are also removing carbon from the air, not just putting it in.
Super, thank you. And Glenn, do you want to jump in on that and speak a bit more to sort of that electrically net zero piece on the energy side?
Sure, and I think numbers really help people, and I'll really round off here. So for the Village of Ryley, our power bill typically over the last few years have been, and I'm going to break it down here, $30,000 that we spend on lighting, street lighting, and things like that, and then $30,000 on all the other municipal buildings, this building, and you know, water pumps and the uplift stations and all the things that are in the village. So that's 30 and 30. Funny enough, under the legislation, the street lighting is not able to get the credits, and we're not allowed to apply the micro generator to that. So, so when we come to your CEIP program, you know, and things like that, we're going to look at seeing if we can really reduce that. But come back to that other 30,000. We're generating the amount of electricity in our solar farm that's off on the edge of the village, and pumping that back into the system in the same that what we're using, which is the tune of about 12,000 of actual commodity, and the 18,000 of that 30,000 is the fixed fee, what we call the fixed fee. It's a variable, but it's fixed fee because it's the amount that goes back that in our case Fortis charges us for the platform, for the what's called the architecture, the infrastructure. So if we were to turn off all of our lights and everything else, the $12,000 worth is what we're paying for, and we're getting that full credit. In fact, we're getting quite a bit more back actually, because it's generating a bit more. But that's a bit what net zero means. So of the electricity we're using, we are generating back that right into the system. So I'm going to say that, you know, a lot of people say, well, that's not really net zero. I mean, you're still, you know, but we're not paying for the electricity. We're paying for that infrastructure system. So if you consider that the $12,000 worth of electricity that we're sucking out of some coal mine somewhere, we are now generating back green, which means that coal mine doesn't have to produce that, and we're saving that. And in fact, just to give it to you, I will say that I'm looking at our solar generator, and we have 1 year ago, a little more than 1 year ago, we went up and we have had a carbon offset of 204 metric tons. We've offset the equivalent of 17 hectares of forest. So, you know, that's one small, very small generator, 144 kilowatt. And I guess what I want to say is that with net zero, you know, it's a goal, and it could be considered arbitrary, because one could say, well, maybe you should be generating, you know, we are actually, you know, the power we're using, we're generating back. So it's just less to be used elsewhere. And I would say it's like a huge pizza, and you get the job done by eating one piece at a time. So we're one piece that we're taking the bite.
Super.
Yeah.
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah. Sorry, Sherry, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick question. So Glenn, if you're producing more electricity than you're actually using, then you're actually you're negative, right? You're not even net zero, you're net negative for your electricity, which is really good for surrounding people.
That's right. And the interesting thing is it's a gift to Ryley, because the way the credits work is we get the credits based on what we're supposed to, what we use. So we're getting full credits, and there's extra going back in the system. Absolutely.
And that helps the rest of us, because we're not quite at net zero at all. And we're aspiring for that, but it looks like it'll be a while before we get there. So net zero generally for Canada requires relationships like this. So if Ryley can offset some of our emissions, because we have in our calculation, our inventory, we have 404,000 tons of carbon emissions per year. And our current offsets, our current carbon sequestration from our natural acid inventory is only 4,000, so 1%. So we have to find a way. So net zero for us, for carbon emissions, means we have to find a way to knock off 99% of our emissions or to offset some of that, right? So, so getting in relationships with towns like Ryley, who are potentially for the municipality itself carbon negative, it would be really great.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, Sherry, that when we're talking about net zero, it's not just in these silos, right? It's as a whole picture. And so it's important, and looking at it from a carbon net zero versus energy net zero, there's lots of different ways that term gets used, but figuring out sort of what those targets are and how you get there. But there's also, municipalities can build their own systems to try and get there. But if they don't have the capacity to do that, so they don't have the space or they don't have other options to actually build those systems, there are options out there as well to do things like virtual power purchase agreements, or there are mechanisms that in place where you can offset, like you say, of getting into those relationships where you're still able to ultimately reduce or get closer to net zero for your targets by having those relationships with other companies or municipalities as well, which is great. I think we'll jump on to our next. This is in a way a good segue into the next question, which is talking a little bit about roadblocks that cities and communities face in relation to this target. So, trying to get to that net zero by 2050, especially for the small municipalities, but even the large ones, there are lots of challenges to overcome to be able to reach those targets. So maybe I'll start. We had Sherry start off last time. I might get Mark to start on this one, since you deal with a lot of different municipalities in your work, talking a little bit about what you've heard from folks about what some of those roadblocks are for achieving net zero.
Yeah, I mean, even for achieving targets below net zero and just taking the first steps and doing some early efficiency or renewables work, there's a lot of barriers for municipalities, and they certainly vary from municipality to municipality. You'll have, some municipalities that have great internal leadership and folks driving a lot of these types of projects, like Sherry and Glenn and so on, and other municipalities, they're much earlier in the process, and that capacity piece is really a huge roadblock for them. And we as the MCCAC have heard that loud and clear over the years since we've been around, that funding for projects is great, but if a municipality hasn't even begun the process of knowing where to start or what needs to be addressed, that they really need help with that. So over the years, we have developed a few capacity building initiatives and funding programs to help specifically address that piece. We've got now the Municipal Energy Manager Program, which is a program that provides funding to municipalities to help cost share on hiring an internal position to get some internal expertise to help do some of this work. We've got the Municipal Energy Champions Program, which is even a step before that, just a voluntary capacity building initiative where we'll do some more direct one-on-one type of work with them using our internal advisor here. We were involved in the Partners for Climate Protection program through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which was, again, an option for municipalities to help have kind of guidance throughout the process of establishing inventories and making plans and following through on those. So yeah, the capacity piece, I think, continues to be a roadblock for many municipalities in the province, but I think those barriers are slowly being addressed. And then I think the other side of the coin is always, once there is a knowledge and understanding of what a municipality can do to help take those steps towards net zero, there's the how do we actually do it piece, and often that comes down to funding. So municipalities have a lot on their plates and a lot of priorities for funding. So finding other sources of funding through various levels of government for cost sharing is often key, or even just finding structures for paying for projects that keep You know, the project, a cash neutral type of initiative that we've seen through a lot of our solar projects that maybe Glenn can speak to and others. But yeah, I think those are some of the major roadblocks that we as the Action Center have seen over the years and tried to address. So.
Fair enough. Yeah, thank you. And I think we'll let Myrna jump in next on this one and talk a little bit about some of the roadblocks that you've seen in the work that you're doing with communities.
Sure. Yeah, I think because of just where we are and how we get called in, you know, and the projects we work on, we see things from a little bit of a different perspective. And a lot of the work we do is to try and de-silo, you know, various aspects of cities. So to help people, one example that I can think of is to help people understand that while they may be investing in, you know, in smart energy efficient streetlights or, you know, industrial IoT, you know, kind of smart sensors to look for energy efficiencies in their cities, that there is also this kind of companion return on investment when you look at how those things can play a role in disaster scenarios, for example, or resilient scenarios. So it's being able to kind of not just look at these things as being spends that people have to make and a return in a specific, you know, kind of energy return calculation, that these things can play a role in, you know, so street lighting, for example, in Kuala Lumpur enabled safer pedestrian journeys for women to use public transit, which reduced GHG. So it's a whole kind of ability to kind of work together and understand the return or the potential of some of these projects in that de-siloed context. And without it, I think, you know, oftentimes cities are stuck, or even our clients who are supplying cities are stuck in their bubble, and they're just trying to push these things through, and they all look like cost, and it's challenging to understand, you know, just all of the ripple effects of them and how they can work together.
Yeah, so the barrier of even just the system itself of how we're organized into our work groups, right, is a barrier in and of itself sometimes. Yeah, that's a great point. Sherry, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about the barriers that you've seen in term? I think you wanted to maybe mention something about target setting or just generally, yeah, well, generally barriers, yeah. I guess.
Well, I guess, yeah, and I'll answer actually the question that's in the chat as well, while I'm, you know, while attention's on me. Yeah, well, so barriers, the initial barrier is that the fact that we don't really have any flexibility. If Canada is setting net zero by 2050, it means we all have to get in line, right? That's something that we all have to do. So I can't say, oh, well, the town of Okotoks is going to do, we're going to reduce by 80%, or, you know, we'll be almost net zero because the goal is Canada. So the goal's already set, like that target's already set. We just have to figure out how we're going to get there, and all of the programs Mark was talking about, and companies like Myrna's will help us kind of model that and see how we can get there in creative ways. I want to talk about, I just want to, there was a question here that says how we feel about renewable or low emissions district heating to reduce greenhouse gas and fossil fuel use. I did put in the chat a link to our Drake Landing solar community, because that's exactly what that is. It's a combination of solar thermal and geothermal borehole storage that puts the heat into the ground and stores it there. It charges the ground as a battery, kind of. It stores heat down there and then recycles it through a heat exchange system to 52 homes in the town of Okotoks. And so that's we're absolutely interested in that. The focus right now has been on in Alberta especially, so I don't know how things are across the country, but and there might be some more interest if your electricity is run on hydro to put everything through electricity and that kind of thing. But in Alberta, we have really cheap natural gas. So the hard thing about doing about reducing space heating is that we're also trying to kind of fight against an industry that's trying to increase our gas usage. So these are kind of political things and social things, right? That's where a lot of our jobs are, we're going to be honest. You know, the heat pumps that are being pushed in for houses they're trying to figure out how to do natural gas run heat pumps just because that's what's going to work here, right? So I don't, like I said, I can't speak for the rest of the country, but I know in Alberta, using natural gas is cleaner than using coal, and we still have a partially coal run electrical grid. So we are focused on individual natural gas, and the infrastructure is already there. We do focus on renewable energy through solar for electricity for that exact reason, is that it can replace our coal power plants. And there's I forgot the one last thing, is that also we have some legislation here in Alberta that doesn't allow municipalities to do kind of community energy necessarily. So we can't sell electricity to our residents, for example, without approval from the minister. And I haven't heard of anybody doing that. The only specific things are Medicine Hat, Edmonton, and Calgary. Those are the only places in Alberta that are allowed to do that. So those are some barriers. It actually ties right into some of the barriers for why we can't do community emissions. You have to there's a few more hoops to jump through on those.
Fair enough. Thanks, Sherry. And Glenn, do you want to jump in on this as well in terms of roadblocks? I know you're in a bit more of the rural context. Do you have any insight as to, you know, the differences in barriers between urban and rural? Because I suspect there are a few.
Well, I'll first just touch quickly on the answer to the question, which, you know, being as small as we are, you know, we're not building neighborhoods, and you know, when we do any growth, it's probably not big enough to be an economy of effort on something at this point with that technology. However, I will say that it's on the table for us. I mean, we're open to all possibilities, and we've got them on the whiteboard, and we're looking at that. And everything we do, we're saying, hey, is there an option here to make sure we're not going down the old road, or is that the only option we have? And so this is one of the ones that for sure I've got, you know, I've got on the sticky on the board saying, you know, I really want to look at, you know, neighborhood thermals and, you know, all kinds of different initiatives like that. But in terms of roadblocks, you know, out here, you know, we call it urban because in relation to Beaver County, we are, you know, one of the 4 urbans, but let's face it, compared to Edmonton or anybody else, especially at 500, we're as rural as you get. So there's this big urban, and then there's this rural urban. And, you know, I'll use the example of school because we're struggling out here with, you know, school districts, and there's always this mentality, what I call urban mentality, when you know, we lobbied to the school division not to close the schools, and for some reason there's always this fundamental concept that centralization, you know, close 2, put it together in 1, there's going to be savings. But what you forget about the rural is that when you do close 2 and make 1, the transportation costs are huge, and people don't really recognize that issue. I mean, to put a face to it, when we're talking about transportation issues for kids in school, I mean, that's a young kid riding an hour on a bus, you know, but the cost of it as well, right? And I'm only using that and picking on that one particular. You could delve in almost any subject. So that's, I think that's one. It's the urban thinking, the big urban thinking that discounts immediately a concept of the small schools, for example, or any other concept or model. You know, just discounts it, thinks it's cute, thinks it's old, thinks it's Little House on the Prairie, it's gone, days gone by. It's big, big, big. And I think there's huge potential to the concept of decentralization, and that concept, you know, we're dealing with it in COVID right now with technology, you know, relying on the technology and leveraging the technology. And it's a real eye opener for people out in urban who are just used to hop in their pickup truck and getting together and doing stuff. And now saying, well, geez, we have to try and figure out if we can do this. Of course you can't till corn or anything else, you know, by virtual, but there is a lot of things you can, such as meet and coordinate and talk like that. So there's education, and I'm talking informal, like, you know, opening people's eyes and saying, you know, what is possible. And it's interesting because that then talks about internet, and we know about the urban, rural internet, you know, broadband People will say, well, you know, why do you need broadband? Well, you know, if you're going to pass information, if you're going to communicate, if you're going to do this, I mean, you know, we need a broadband. I can tell you, you know, my background, I happen to have a computer science degree. I was in the Army for 30 years. I live in Edmonton. I commute out here. So I know all about the big technology and everything else, but I grew up on a small farm when I was a kid, so I'm loving it out here. But I'm able to grab all these things and put these things together and say, you know, that's one of the first things I did. I got us off the dial up, and, you know, I got us on high speed here so that I could be here on this video. And we're trying to leverage that out to our community. So again, I'd say education, the informal education, the abilities, the mechanisms such as internet access, the thinking big urban versus rural urban, and then, yeah, project central, just the decentralized concepts.
Super, thank you. So I mean, it kind of leads us into a good space here, I think, to talk about those are the roadblocks, but what do we need to do to move that needle forward to get past those things, right? I think COVID is a really good example, Glenn, that you brought up of, you know, things moved pretty quickly to make sure that we could still function during COVID. And there's been a lot of parallel comparison to the action that was taken on COVID and the quick, big action. That same type of action needs to be taken on these issues, the SDGs, but also the issue of climate change, right? Of making sure that we're moving as quickly and as big as we can. So what actions are needed to move that needle forward in this sense? Is it actions by different levels of government, industry, all of them? Sherry, do you want to start us off with some thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Glenn's right. The actions start by seeing what's possible, and I think COVID itself has shown everybody that everything is a lot more possible than we thought. You know, I did struggle with trying to implement a policy for work from home, and before COVID, and then, you know, thanks COVID, that there's my missions plan. I'm good. But we really do need to be able to envision what's possible. And so the actions for that are stuff like peer networks and seeing what's happening other places and trying those out. Municipal Climate Change Action Center is called Action Center for a reason. They're really good at, we need more organizations like that who reach out to places and communities and see what's being done elsewhere and bring those tools to places where the capacity is not as great, to be able to hire a whole team of energy managers, right? To be able to figure out how are we going to put Okotoks or Ryley on the map, because Glenn and I are just one person each, right? And we don't necessarily have the capacity, you know, to see all of the different things. And if we're just one person in each of our communities, Glenn, have you got a climate change coordinator over there? No. Right. And so we're the town of Okotoks. We have 30,000 people. We have me, right? And I'm the energy manager and the climate change coordinator, right? And I'm learning, that's not my whole skill set. So I'm learning as I go. So I think those actions are networking, the actions are funding and capacity building. The actions are ensuring that our higher levels of government are actually, we're lobbying our higher levels of government to make sure that the funding and the support is there, and that we're all on the same page. And then ensuring that our populace have the opportunities to put those things into place. You mentioned the Clean Energy Improvement Program. That's we're not one of the top 3, but we're not too far behind. We've passed our bylaw, and we're going to help our residents who want to improve their homes anyway to be able to retrofit their homes to be more energy efficient, because well, it's great to get net zero on every new home, so net zero energy, net zero carbon on every new home that's built. We also, like, that doesn't take into consideration the 75% of our single family homes currently that are not net zero carbon, right? So in order to reduce our emissions and to increase our energy efficiency, we need to make sure that those homes have access to the retrofitability and funding for improving their own homes.
And it's a good point to, and you talk about the Clean Energy Improvement Program, that's one way that that can happen, right? But are there other things at the municipal level that that a municipality can do specifically to move that forward from a building? Let's, sort of narrow it down to that building perspective that you were talking about. I know code is set. Ultimately, the initial code is set federally, it's adopted by the provinces, and there's not a lot that municipalities can do outside of charter cities in Alberta to actually set any, you can't set code higher than what code exists, but are there other mechanisms that you can use to try and encourage that type of either retrofit or new builds to be happening if the code isn't quite at net zero yet?
Well, thanks for the reminder, because we're working on a green buildings program currently, which has to be put forward with incentives, right? That those are, we are starting kicking that off. We're looking at what other people are doing. But like Toronto has their green roof program, right? And they started off as being their cool roof / green roof program for all new builds in Toronto. They have to have a cool roof to offset urban heat islanding effect, right? But that started off as an incentive program because we're not allowed to say we have to put them in because of code. We're not allowed to expect better than code or to enforce better than code. So currently what we have to do is find incentives. So perhaps if you meet green building standards, then we can fast track your application. Those are things that we have under our control, and those are things that we can put into place. And that we can't get sued for.
Always an important point. Glenn, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I think first of all, when I look at the landscape, I appreciate the federal and the provincial initiatives and especially agencies like yourself, the MCCAC, that help us. I mean, it's all about funding, and then there's that gap that's left, and we at the municipality level, we collect taxes, so we have all this money sitting, and we rotate it through a cash flow issue and everything. It's not that we have a lot of money, but we've got our hands on a bunch of money. So, in the back of my mind, I often like to remind myself and remind my colleagues that, the question of who are they, they always do that stuff, and they, and often it's good to look in the mirror and say, you know what, I am they, we are they. You got to start with yourself, and you got to start to take action. And so, we're looking at possibilities of saying things like, if I'm sitting there looking at my capital reserve and it's sitting there in the bank and it's making some interest, so we can save ourselves, maybe shave off a bit of taxes, or maybe get an extra sidewalk out of, the fund because it's sitting there ready for 5 years from now. We're going to talk about it a little later, I think, but the investment in the future, maybe we can't afford not to say, you know what, why not, either it's a loan or it's a grant, and maybe we can push it to our residents to help them, because in terms of the municipality pumping out a micro generator, it's one thing. I'm a homeowner too in Edmonton, and I've looked at it many times, and it's compared to my municipal budget, it's peanuts, but to my budget, I can't afford to go and put that money out to go get those solar panels on my roof, but I sure would like to, and if I could, I would. So if I as an administrator and if our elected officials are interested, which my feel is they are, then I think we can do things like that. Whatever we can do to communicate and listen and try and do and help our communities do it. Again, it's that pizza. Now in this case, it's each house is that pizza bite, and one bite at a time.
Super, thanks. So I'm gonna try and get Mark and Myrna to jump in on the next question here. So cities need to carefully consider their net zero planning, because without it, they stand to lose the very ambition that drives them, which is ultimately wealth, culture, quality of life, investment. So what shift have you seen in regards to this balance between economic growth and environment or sustainability in your work? Myrna, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think another shift I would add to that is equity. So I think when people are looking at, some of the trade-offs that have been built into our systems in the past, that now is a really important time, that when we are making those calculations and we are deciding where and how and what neighborhoods and what types of policies or programs, that we can really understand how we have been investing in the past, and ensure that we consider equity in the future. So I think that's, it's not binary anymore, I think is the obvious, kind of answer. But it's also, an opportunity once we kind of release ourselves from that binary, is it a trade-off or is it a balance? It's like, no, it's the future. And there are so many more things that we can also address, as we're making some of these big shifts.
Super, thanks. And Mark, have you seen sort of a shift in that balance between economic growth and dealing with those environmental and sustainability issues?
Yeah, for sure. It definitely is unique to every municipality. I know, having spoken with Sherry and others, there's situations where, of course, you're still dealing with folks in municipal operations or councils where they very much do see it as a binary, and that these two things of economy and environmental action can't go hand in hand. But I would say, on the whole, generally, as the MCCAC dealing with hundreds of municipalities across the province over the years, we've seen a pretty clear shift in that narrative from being much more of a binary earlier on to now. The connection is, I think, being made much more clearly for a lot of municipalities that economic development and environmental action can and do go hand in hand, and whether that is in their own operations with things like these projects we've been speaking about, solar PV developments for reaching net zero and all the cost savings that come with that, energy efficiency work, et cetera, or even when we're talking more broadly about some of the municipalities that we deal with in southern Alberta, who are now seeing all this really massive utility scale renewable energy development going up in their regions, and recognizing that, hey, this is the future of our tax base, as the energy transition kind of continues. They're just, I think, accepting that reality and wanting to be a part of it, not wanting to be left behind, I think, is something that we are hearing a lot more from municipalities as this energy transition continues, and wanting to have a future that is a part of that. So yeah, I think it's been positive overall, recognizing that there is still definitely in individual instances where that dichotomy is still active, but I think overall making the connection between all of the economic benefits that can be seen from doing some of this work is becoming more obvious.
Yeah, and I would add too that in some of our work internationally, it's becoming really important to be able to demonstrate the impact in order to access investment funds. So it's now, if you don't do it, you're actually economically disadvantaging yourself, even in the amount of investment and support you can get for a lot of these projects.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Myrna. I think the world is really sort of at that pivotal point where that shift is happening, right? That if you're not taking these things into consideration, you're actually at a disadvantage. Even from an insurance standpoint, there's that whole world is starting to look at things differently as well from an environmental and sustainability standpoint. So it's I think by the very nature of that shift, things will just start to accelerate, because they have to. And in order for business to keep going, everyone will need to be taking these things into consideration. So we talked a little bit earlier about incentives, and I might come back to Glenn and Sherry on this one for what incentives are available to help bridge that gap for clean energy solutions. I know, Sherry, you gave one example of incentives in Toronto for green roofs to be done, and that's an option for builders. If we're looking at from the perspective within a community of builders, homeowners, human behavior, how do we put incentives in place to help bridge the gap to start adopting those clean energy solutions? Do you want to start that one off, Sherry?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of ways to incentivize people. The first and most obvious one is money, right? If you give them a tax break, if you give them and there are a lot of, if you give them a lower if you have the money back. We have a water conservation rebate program where funding is obtained from our high water users, and we have a tiered water user system, and in our high tiered water system, that money comes back and we give that to residents in the form of rebates for water smart gardening, so xeriscape programs and plant and drought tolerant plants and oh my goodness, rocks, whatever. I've totally forgotten the name for it. It's blanked. Anyways, that's how that goes. Anyways, for any drought tolerant things that also promote wildlife, right? So we don't, and for example, give you a rebate on fake grass, like artificial turf, because that doesn't actually contribute to a biodiversity thing, right? We have multi-use things, but we do put it towards a drought tolerant turf. So if you really need grass, or if you're going to put in drought tolerant plants, so all that kind of stuff. So there's obviously just the money, which you can fund through other programs, and I don't want to use the word punish, but profit off of those who prefer not to reduce, and by charging them more. There are also ways, like I mentioned before, of like fast tracking things, right? Making things easier. The SEEP makes things easier by not tying it to somebody else, to a person, tying it to the property, because that's where the benefit is, right? Like paving your alleyway. If you move, you wouldn't want to still have to pay for a loan to pay for your alley when you're on your next house. The solar panels are the same. If you move, you want to leave them on your house, or if you insulate your house, you're not going to go and take that insulation with you to your next house, right? So making things easier and tied to the property itself, so that whoever is benefiting from it is the one that's paying for it. The other incentives are to fast track things, like I said about the green buildings thing, right? That doesn't cost us anything, but it allows us to have a higher standard in things that are built. So it can come in the form of money, it can come in the form of facilitating and making things easier, and it can come in the form of choosing and prioritizing applications for better builds.
Super, thank you. And Glenn, do you want to jump in on that? Do you think ultimately people will adopt clean energy solutions if it's not mandated? I know Sherry's given some good examples as to why they might.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, we would discuss this a little later, and this is now in the, to be clear, the initiative, the things I talked about, these are not initiatives. I don't want people running around saying Ryley's doing this and Ryley's doing that. I mean, we're talking about these things, right? All the things that Sherry says, I mean, these are ideas, and they're good ideas, and I think we need to do them. Human behavior is funny. It's generally proven that people are just not going to change their behavior unless they're forced to. But that said, that forcing can kind of be less forcing and more coercive, and sometimes leading. So I would say all of the above: the educate, the coerce, the motivate, the assist. But one way or another, I believe it all comes down to engaging and making sure that we understand and we help everybody understand what needs to be done to get there, and build that path together, because we need everything. We need every type of initiative we can come up with, and so all the ideas in the arena.
Super. And I think, oh,
go ahead. I was just going to jump in and say absolutely all the ideas are needed, right? And if anybody has ideas, I can leave my email. You have ideas, let me know, because I'm just one person. I'll share them with Glenn. But yeah, we need all the ideas. So 100%.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I think it's a great example too of both Okotoks and Ryley and other municipalities that are sort of on the leading edge of this type of thing, is leading by example. And in that same view of trying to do all of the things, or at least have a whole bunch of different options out there. If there are a number of different municipalities in the same area, or even within a province, that are doing a whole bunch of different things, the community itself will see that as well, right? And we celebrate those good news stories, and we talk about those things, and we see them in the news, and ultimately that starts to shift the sort of collective mentality towards, oh, maybe this is possible, and it just sort of moves that needle forward a bit more as well, I think. So yeah, those are some great points. And getting on to sort of the digitalization side of this, getting into the technology, which I think is ultimately where Myrna lives most of the time in her world. But so how can digitalization enable communities or cities to create a range of distributed energy platforms to support those net zero goals? You know, we've talked about the importance of sort of decentralizing. How do we make sure that as many people as possible can participate, and how does technology help us with that?
I think one of the places we start is being able to measure and being able to understand and use technology to really characterize unique and distinct differences and needs between, you know, neighborhoods or within communities, because I don't think it's kind of a you know, one size fits all. I think being able to look forward and understand things that are coming too is super important in digitalization. So we're about to be inundated by electric vehicles. I don't know if anybody's heard that news story, but there is a profound and kind of discontinuous trend and trajectory in purchasing behavior that they're anticipating. And this is going to just head spin the grid, the way it is structured now in the hub and spoke model. And it really has a lot to do with how people understand their relationship with the grid and participate in the grid and managing, you know, load and understanding their role in peak kind of shaving and how they can implement technologies and how they can participate with storage to, you know, even help manage grid load. So I think there's going to have to be a kind of a huge educational curve for us as we, you know, grow, no matter how big, you know, or small the region is, and how we use our technologies to participate in that grid management. And I also think that alongside with that comes the decentralization, you know, part in Decentralized Energy Canada. But there is an enormous amount of opportunity to understand the role that these sustainable energy technologies like battery storage and photovoltaics and self-generation can play in resilience, because that's also the news story that's happening around the world and is coming, I think, to a neighborhood near you. And this shouldn't be seen as something that is, kind of that just happens to us and we're unprepared. That we can actually look at how, you know, we can incent or motivate people to look after their own energy needs, because if you know, big storms hit or really kind of or cyber attack or black sky, things that, you know, are unnatural kind of disasters, we can, using sustainable spends and technologies, enable people to look after themselves and create a far more resilient society. So I think all of these things kind of go hand in hand. It's just going to take a bit of digital kind of magic and management and participation from all of the stakeholders who are involved in it to move that forward. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, but there's a ton of stuff going on behind the meter, at the meter, you know, around the meter, and it's all on the table now, which is exciting. And I think it'll be interesting to kind of engage in those conversations.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, that, you know, as the average user of electricity, you don't necessarily think what's happening beyond your property or your home, or, you know, to you turning on a light switch. But at the higher level, these conversations are happening at, you know, the people that manage the grid and realize that the technologies are available. I think right now, maybe Myrna, you can speak to that a little bit, that a lot of the technologies we need to as solutions exist. It's yes. Getting them deployed, I think, is sort of the next step, right?
It's getting them deployed, and it's actually engaging communities like we have here in that energy conversation, because we've been kind of saying, oh, it's up to the utilities. You know, they've done a great job for the last how many years, but now everything is changing. Their landscape is changing too. And so, you know, individuals and community members and neighborhoods and municipalities need to all become engaged in that discussion. And I think that's, you know, one of the most critical, you know, kind of understanding and factors and shifts that not only enable sustainability in the SDG11, but it also, you know, kind of is going to be necessary in managing the grid infrastructure.
Super, thank you. Mark, do you want to jump in and talk a bit more about electric vehicle infrastructure and sort of well, maybe the digitization or just electric vehicle infrastructure generally in the Alberta context?
Yeah, definitely not as much of an expert on the digitalization piece as Myrna is, but just generally, I think everything she's mentioned about the evolution of the grid and all the opportunities that are going to be arising from the ability to kind of look at the grid as a two-way system with the decentralized energy component, and then things like electric vehicles and their charging infrastructure, you know, having that ability to be both a source of energy and storage of energy in a home or commercial context. All that is definitely going to uproot the grid as we know it. I think as far as our work, we're trying to get municipalities thinking about that now and preparing for it in a variety of ways. So we've got funding incentive programs available to subsidize the costs of electric vehicles as part of the municipal fleet, and have some charging infrastructure associated with that, which has had some uptake, which has been promising. And now we are also going to be rolling out an electric vehicle charging program specific just to infrastructure, charging infrastructure for municipalities for the use in the broader community in the coming months, which we hope will, really prepare communities across the province to be able to deal with this influx of electric vehicles that's coming. And, you know, it's been really interesting to see how many municipalities are already interested in, you know, knocking on the door for this kind of support to get more electric vehicle charging infrastructure in place, because they really see that as an economic development opportunity as well in attracting that consumer base, you know, wanting to become the stop that someone who's taking their electric vehicle across the province will use their city as a stop to charge up and then spend money in the community and all the rest of that. So you know, I think it's something we're excited for here at the Action Center and trying to prepare municipalities in the province for as much as possible.
Super, yeah, thank you. And if they combine those electric vehicle charging stations with a solar array like you have in the village of Ryley, even better, right? You've got clean electricity powering those EVs.
And soon coming to, you know, electric vehicles near you is also V2X technology. So if cities or municipalities or utilities can help incent or even, you know, fund or finance people to put disconnect switches in their homes, they'll be able to utilize that battery power in the vehicle to not only shave peak, because they won't be using the grid, but also during emergencies, you can power a home for up to 4 days.
With an EV battery, yeah. Yeah, it's not just for transportation anymore. Sherry, do you want to jump in on the public transportation side of things? I know Okotoks has a pretty exciting initiative, and there's one or two other municipalities in Alberta that are sort of following your lead on this of on-demand transit and how that works from a digitization perspective.
Yeah, no, 100%. I was going to say it's actually a really good lead-in, because the EV networks for any EV drivers, we've already digitized all of that, so you know exactly where your charging station is and how much you need to charge, and you can program in how far you can go on each charge and get there, right? So I think that's really excellent. We've also used the digitization to try to as part of our on-demand transit system. So we are a small-ish community. I mean, we're not small like Ryley, but we're smaller than some of those really big urban centers with really big transit options. But so when we were looking at installing transit into Okotoks, we saw some of the costs for having a fixed route busing systems, and that just wasn't going to work for people in Okotoks, because by the time you get on and then get off again, sometimes that whole thing is an hour if you have a fixed route, and you could walk faster or something like that. And maybe it's not running at the right time. So we implemented an on-demand service, which what it does is it's curb to curb, so it picks you up at your house and takes you to your location. And it has an algorithm that that programs in other requests in that area to try to, and we have 3 buses, and they're hybrid buses. They're little vans, actually. Buses is a bit of an exaggeration. But they're more of a ride sharing service, right? So that the buses each, and the algorithm will show you which of the people we're going to pick on the way and what the best way to get there is. So it reduces travel time. It promotes ride sharing, and they're hybrid vehicles, and it does all of this through through an app that maximizes or optimizes your route.
Have you seen increased ridership from your previous? Did you had transit previous to that? I'm assuming, or you didn't. No. This is the first.
This is the first transit we've ever had, and we need to increase our capacity, because it's in the first year. So we put it in. The first year was ended kind of right as, or the first 3 months kind of ended right as COVID started, but our numbers a little wonky, but they are the number of people and the number of rides that are going are 150% of anything we expected in our modeling. So it's really gotten a huge uptake. I'm gonna brag that our transit guy got a minister's award from the Alberta Environment for the digitization and the uniqueness, the innovation of how we put that together. So we're really proud of our transit system, and yeah, because it meets all of those things. It's a social initiative, it's an environmental initiative, and I mean, it's not cheap, but it's like it gets people to where they're going, and it meets all the needs of our community, right? So
absolutely, that's amazing. We're getting really close to the time for Q&A here, and I just want to make sure. Myrna, did you want to add anything on the sort of that piece on the democratization of energy into here, or have we kind of covered most of it?
I think I covered a lot of it during, when I was talking about decentralization, that I really think that it's going to become more and more, especially in regions in the world, even like California, where the number of power outages and power reliability is really becoming a central driver in where people choose to live, and how they have to manage their own self-sufficiency, to keep their households going and their productivity, work productivity. It was huge even during COVID, when people were in their homes and they really understood just how much power unreliability there was. So I think the democratization of energy is going to be really interesting as people begin to look around at what their options are. And it's super important to have sustainable, options there and available and understood and supported in their communities, so that they can make those really good choices, rather than in California, there was a real shift towards, diesel powered generators and carbon powered generators, which then compounded in issues of air quality when power was unreliable. So I think, being there to help people make the right decisions with the best technology that's available is just huge in this process.
Yeah, and everyone kind of taking a bit more control on their own, as opposed to relying on the system to do it for them, right? Yeah. That's amazing. So our last question that we have, I think it's sort of a nice way to wrap things up. And we've talked about what needs to be done, the barriers, how we can maybe get there. And I think a lot of this, often the conversation steers towards, oh well, it's so expensive. And so I want to kind of end this on, what is the cost of inaction if we don't reach these targets of net zero by 2050, if we don't make our cities more sustainable and meet the 17 SDGs, meet our climate targets? Is the cost what is the cost of inaction? Because I don't think it's ultimately just a financial cost, right? Is it what are we trading off? Is it what does that look like? And we're going to get everyone to jump in on this. So Glenn, do you want to start us off there?
Yeah, I like to remark when we were starting to build our microgenerator, and a lot of the discussion was exactly that. It was on the cost. It was like, what's this going to cost, and what's going to be the return of investment on it? And I turned that, we turned that conversation around, and we really showed the numbers afterwards, and talked about exactly that. Say, this is not about a capital project that's going to convert us so we can save some money. This is a capital project so we can spend the money to save the earth, and that conversation should be there. We've heard it. Should I turn around and go green and pay an extra $1 for each kilowatt hour on my bill because I'm a responsible human being? But I'll tell you what I liked about this whole thing is after I finally got the conversation off the financials, off of that, I then unveiled the fact that in actual fact, we are making a little money. So that's a good thing. But again, that wouldn't have been possible without the MCCAC granting, getting us the grant and, making the project cheaper. So are those grants going to dry up at some point? We know that the status quo is, carbon pricing and carbon penalties and things, and just purely the penalties to the industries that are going to start shrinking are going to make these commodities a lot more expensive. And then we're going to be spending that money to keep ourselves going, and we're not going to have the money to be investing in the initiatives and change. So, pivot time is now. We got to move. We know, I think, to answer the question directly, I think it's almost an obvious question. We know there's a climate crisis, and we know that we have to get off, we're junkies and we have to get off it.
Yeah, fair enough. The long-term costs ultimately of the impacts of climate change will be so much higher than what we need to spend now to try and mitigate those impacts, right? So, Mark, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I think Glenn touched on it a little bit. What I was going to mention on the strictly ones and zeros sides of thing. If you are a municipality or entity of any kind that decides that the cost of doing solar PV or any other type of initiative right now is too high, we do have a scheduled carbon tax now federally with increases very clearly laid out over the next several years, and the math is fairly straightforward to see. If I decide not to do this project today, here's what the cost will be, and it's very clearly going to cost a lot more in the long run with the carbon pricing as it is. So there's that simple side of things to look at. From the other side of things on the cost of inaction, not wanting to get too doom and gloom, but it is, as Glenn said, a climate crisis, and the implications will be far-reaching across society if we aren't able to address this. It's been touched on in a few different questions already, but I think I mentioned it as well about being left behind, and municipalities not wanting to be left behind from an economic perspective. That's certainly something to be considered, not to mention just the natural reality of what these impacts will have in terms of natural disasters and all the social and health implications that will have. So I think it is a conversation that is moving in the right direction, but I think our economic analysis at a community level and across the board really needs to start to be a bit reimagined and re-envisioned into considering all these costs of inaction in very real terms when we're discussing any type of steps toward net zero or otherwise.
Super, thanks. Myrna, I'll let you weigh in next, and then we'll end. We'll give Sherry the last word, which is always dangerous.
I think you can't afford not to act. Like it's I don't know, a couple of years ago it was really striking for me. I was attending a conference in Singapore around clean tech, and they painted the band around the earth that they're going to be looking for food security and arable lands and everything at 4 degrees C. They're already planning for 4 degrees C. And guess where it falls? Hey, Canada. And so it's super important that we are stewards of this, and we understand our role in kind of participating and protecting what we have, and really kind of making that shift and building that capacity, because I think climate migration is also another thing that we're being asked to model. And it's already beginning to happen. And I think it's trying to understand and prepare how we participate in, sometimes I think we're just looking at tomorrow. and really there's quite a runway out there of things that are happening around the world that we figure into. And we need to be responsible and aware and prepared and then try to be, some of the leaders in this category too, I think.
Super, thanks. I'll let Sherry give her thoughts on that, and then we have a few questions in the Q&A that we'll get to.
Okay, I don't have a lot to add about the cost of inaction, but I do want to I do think that what we need to do is remember that money is a tool, right? It's a tool to get what we need. It is not the be all and end all. And so instead of doing things because they're financially the best decision for today, we have to say, what can we do with our money, not what can our money do for us, right? Like, it's the other way around. So I was reading an article last year that said that for municipalities especially, that the cost benefit system doesn't work very well for municipalities, because we are around. We're going to be around for the next 100 years. It's supposed to be a cost benefit for like a short-term period, because our benefits, we can't even measure those, the measures that we have, and we can't measure the costs, the cost of avoidance, or we can't measure those for the future, because we have no idea what those emergent costs are going to be. What we are supposed to be doing is providing the services to make our citizens and our residents living their best life, to use the millennial term, right? So if that's what we're doing, then we need to look after the things that they can't afford to do on their own individually. And we stop using money as a proxy for well-being and use it as a tool for well-being.
Super, thank you. I think that's a good place to end it, unless anybody else wants to add in before we get to the Q&A. Crickets, great. Okay, so our first question it's a really interesting one. What kind of relationship do you think future communities will have with utilities? Does anybody want to jump in on that, Glenn?
Yeah, I will. I think it's a great one, and it comes to mind when we hook our micro generator up to Fortis, and suddenly Fortis is faced with saying, well, wait a minute, our pipeline is for delivering. And so therefore we're now talking about connecting it back in, and they're going, well, we're in the business of delivering that. What's going on here, right? So they're probably not too happy about it. But then when they really think about it, they honestly analyze it, they're a super highway. So why can't it work double direction, right? So if we want to just turn around and say, hey, it's happening, then we end up with this combative thing, because they're a business, they're a company, they're in the business, they're in their business to make money. And if we aren't engaging and we aren't coming up with ideas in the early stages of how to work together, then they're going to sit in their boardrooms and they're going to figure out how they can make money. And we're going to end up with these divergences, these dichotomies that are going to be competing. Situations are not going to be good. We're going to have alternative ways to start, decentralizing and sending our power, for example. I'm using power as an example. So I really think engaging is very important. And I think that is going to be a huge leverage benefactor for future communities to make and municipalities to make sure they engage those businesses so they can help shape them.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else want to jump in on that? The kind of relationship you think future communities will have with utilities?
I was going to add, just from the perspective of resilience too. I think we assume a lot about critical infrastructure and being looked after, And there's some fantastic work being done by, the utilities in critical infrastructure, whether it's power or water or the rest of it. But I think that there also needs to be kind of a little bit more understanding of the impacts to communities of the decisions that they're making at that level. And that those need to be shared so that communities can decide or participate in saying, you know what, like we would really rather bury those lines, and because look at the loss that we suffer as a community, or look at how challenging it's been to bring Fort McMurray back. Will it ever come back? That these hits that we take when that may be calculated, kind of spends in the utility world, to our communities maybe need to be revisited from the community perspective. And there needs to be just far more collaboration, like Glenn was saying, and open participation, I think.
Super, thanks for that. So the next question we've got is, are any of you aware of any new insurance business models that reward communities for designing resilient communities with faster recovery capabilities? I think, Myrna, you may have had a response for this one too.
Yeah, not any products that I'm aware of, but I know that the insurance companies are all kind of actively engaging in understanding just what the gaps are. Because reinsurance is getting more and more challenging, I think, as the global kind of disasters are happening in a faster and faster rate. And so I think these abilities to kind of look at and understand just what that gap is, and with the difference between a resilient community and one that isn't, and exactly what the impact is of these disasters, they're still even trying to fully assess. But insurance companies is an interesting question, because they are left with a lot of the burden of critical infrastructure failure and lack of, islanding capability for people who have solar panels and those kinds of things. So yeah, I think that's a really important.
Yeah, maybe a model that we'll see in soon as they sort of come to terms with the costs of what happens when you don't have a resilient community.
Anybody? Just point out that we in Okotoks we have a Honda dealership that put in solar panels to cover their vehicles, and I've seen this happen quite a few more times, and it's because the solar panels not only produce energy but also are highly resilient to storm and hail damage, right? So we know that they put in, despite it being a bit of a fight with them to put them on, because they just wanted to put protection because it was going to be cheaper, whatever else, they got a massive discount on their insurance premiums because of the weather resistance. So they don't even care if those solar panels produce; they're actually using them as shields, right, for against weather and against weather weather patterns, and it saves them so much money on their vehicles. And then that is an example of low carbon resilience, right, where it both reduces the energy produced by fossil fuels, it produces renewable energy, and it's adaptive, right? It adapts to the changes brought on by the climate that we already know. And I think Myrna's absolutely right, is that insurance companies are the front end of this. They are sponsoring a lot of the research on this. The University of Waterloo and their relationship with Intact Insurance are sponsoring a lot of the climate resilience work going on. So this is one place where the insurance companies kind of are ahead of the game.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sherry. That's a great example. Next one. Oh, hang on. Sorry, I think it's a clarity. I think insurance companies need to provide incentives to encourage resilient design. Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, which I think is sort of what we've been talking about. Next question is for Mark. So does MCCAC have a per kilowatt hour price that the carbon tax represents? Is it currently buried into the electricity commodity price, so it isn't as simple to do the calculations for how carbon pricing impacts project payback like it is for natural gas, where they separate out the carbon tax?
Yeah, I was reading this, and maybe we can probably connect offline. It would be easier to get the details across. We don't have a number that we run with in every situation, but we've done a couple instances where we've helped municipalities model this out a little bit. Basically, for solar PV systems, we're just looking at the expected generation of the system over the life based on capacity and all the rest, and then having an estimate on the Alberta grid factor as it would develop over the years as far as the emissions intensity, and then using that along with the scheduled carbon tax increase to kind of crunch the numbers. So if you want to send me an email on that, I'm happy to connect offline.
Super. I think that was our last question. We're just about at 1:30 here. Thanks again to everyone for your great engagement today. I don't know if anybody from DEC wants to come back on and wrap things up.
Yeah, I will.
Super.
Yeah, I'll just quickly wrap things up by saying thanks to all the panelists for coming out and speaking at this event. Like, the conversation was amazing, super engaging. I learned a lot. If anybody who attended the panel has any other questions for our panelists, like, feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you with whoever you'd like to talk to. Same if any of the panelists want to connect to any of the attendees, just let me know and I'll make that connection. And, you know, follow us on social media for other panels that are coming up as part of the UN's SDGs. But that's it from me. And I just wanted to say thanks so much to everybody for participating. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.